women really have to advocate for themselves. And we're taught that it's selfish to, put our needs first. And, people will pay all kinds of money to get married, and they'll pay all kinds of money for honeymoons, and they'll even, pay a lot of money for the birth they want. But like investing money in care for a woman postpartum, that's a lot of women won't do that. If their baby needed something, you better believe they're going to spend 150. They're going to spend, $15,000 if their baby needs something. But for women to put their own health at the center of the equation is really pretty radical.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I am Ashton Szabo, your host. Today's show is about motherhood, about the feminine, and about how it all relates to the spiritual path. Our guest today is Kimberly Ann Johnson. She's a yogini, a body worker, a doula, a postpartum women's health specialist, and founder of Magamama, a resource and community for women going through the birth and postpartum experience. Really happy to have her on the show today. Kimberly, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Ashton.
Oh, you're a mother, so obviously you have a personal connection to birthing and the whole experience of motherhood. But what is it that really inspired you to get into this line of work?
It was having a baby myself. I think I've always been fascinated by birth, but then when I had a baby myself, and I really thought that my yoga practice and all the experience that I had as a body worker, I didn't anticipate at all the difficulty that I would have postpartum. And I just really trusted my body and thought that all of the practice and all of the development and personal work that I'd done had taken me to a place where I didn't see why I would have any problem birthing or have any difficulty postpartum. And actually, I hadn't even given much thought at all to postpartum. Like most women, I had done tons of preparation for giving birth, and I had done no preparation for what comes after that. I didn't even know that that was a thing. And so because of my own postpartum experience, which was very extreme and difficult and painful, I realized that it actually wasn't just me that was having a lot of the difficulty, that there just is a real absence of care for women postpartum. All of the attention shifts towards the baby, and the woman and the relationship really kind of get shoved to the side. And so based on my experience, I just set out to heal myself. I was told that I needed a full surgical pelvic floor reconstruction, and I knew that that was something that I did not want to have. And so I just started researching everywhere I could about how to heal myself holistically. And when I found great resources that were related to the work that I had already been doing, women started just coming to me and saying, oh, my tailbone's been hurting for 3 years since I had my first baby, and I've had another baby, but it's still hurting. And I'd say, well, has anyone worked on it yet? And they say no. And I said, well, do you want to give it a try? And then we would work on it, and it would take 45 minutes and the pain would be gone. So I was just really motivated to help women have these conversations that are usually silent, and that people, women kind of either prematurely get back to the form of their yoga practice that they knew beforehand, or they just sort of disappear for a while and don't really have the conversations. It's hard to know where to have the conversations about the changes that we go through when we become mothers, because the 6-week doctor visit certainly isn't an elaborate space to talk about the emotional side, the sexual side, the physical side. And so I decided that I wanted to be able to really receive women and couples at that time.
Amazing. So one of the things I want to kind of get into in our conversation today is that this idea that all over the planet and throughout history, initiation and ritual have always been a really essential part of our human experience. And giving birth obviously is a very powerful initiation, whether it's, considered to be so consciously or not. But it seems like our modern Western cultures lost touch with how to navigate this process. I mean, even kind of as you were saying in your own experience, I mean, the typical process of going to the doctor afterwards, it's not really fulfilling the entire holistic side of the experience for women. In your opinion, how important is ritual in recognizing the immensity of this transition, of the initiation into this new stage of life and coming over that gap between maiden to mother?
I think it's extremely important that we start to revive some of the ritual or create our own kinds of rituals. Um, I think that it's becoming a little bit more well known that women have, instead of having baby showers, or in addition to having baby showers, women have mother blessings when they're pregnant. And I really recommend having a postpartum ritual, which could be at the 3 month mark, or could be um, gathering the women that gathered beforehand and having a ceremony that's sort of closing that space. Of course, the postpartum time differs from woman to woman, but there's just a real absence. And when ritual is in place, much like for death in our culture, there we don't really have, certain religion, like Jews have a very robust tradition around grieving, and but I'd say overall we're lacking these ritual structures put in place so that you can actually move forward without having residue from the last stage. So what I feel is that in the postpartum stage, what happens is, if you read research like John Gottman's relationship research, and couples are their relationship, they're separating or they're getting divorced, and you ask both of them, when did this start to break down? Often it started to break down in the first year after kids. And it's known that this is just a very vulnerable time. But what's not known is that vulnerable doesn't mean it has to go in the negative direction. It also means that there's this latent space where things can actually be strengthened and potentiated. And ritual helps that. So if we had a ritual, for instance, that 2 days postpartum, a woman's closest female relative, or if there isn't somebody that she could think of, a close friend, that there would be someone that's hired to come over as a postpartum doula. And at that time, she would have regular massages, and she would have spiritual companionship, and she'd be supported to rest. You'd be so surprised at, number one, how fewer people would have postpartum depression, how much closer the couples would be after that time, because a woman is really getting the care that she needs. And those are types of rituals. Type of ritual is that women gather around you after you have birth. And here it's like after 4 or 5 days, most partners go back to work because they don't really have paternity leave, or they have a week. And then women are kind of left alone with an occasional visitor that shows up and doesn't really understand that they're there to help the woman. They're not there to hold the baby or give a cute baby outfit, that the woman actually needs care at this time. And there's different levels of ritual, and there's different levels of awareness of what kind of rituals are necessary. But at the very basic level, it would just be, okay, ideally a woman would be getting, daily oil massage, daily very nourishing food made for her, and almost continual companionship. Not like someone has to be sitting next to her all the time, but that there's somebody in another room, or there's somebody very close by that's there for physical support if she needs a glass of water, or is there to have the hard conversation, or to tell her when she's crying that it's normal and it's intense and it will shift. But what happens is this period gets very diffuse and very spread out, because it's not respected at the beginning. And then only when the crisis happens, more support comes in. And then it's, I deal a lot with all aspects of postpartum, but say if we're going to just focus on birth injuries or organ prolapse, a woman prolapses at 6 months or 9 months and doesn't understand and doesn't relate it to the birth because they were fine after the birth. But it's because of inadequate recovery and inadequate ritual support around what a woman really needs at this time. And I feel like our culture loves youth so much. And so all of the memes around postpartum are like, get your body back, get back to who you were before, get back to sex. And it's really a rich, rich time of maturation that when we have the right support can actually feel good, even if it's deep sorrow or deep grief or elation. That change, its quality changes when we have witnesses and when we're held in a space with other people who have gone through those transitions, and just their very presence somatically informs us that we are going to come out on the other side and that it will be a good thing where we come out.
This kind of brings up a thought in me as well of that, like a lot of spiritual paths in the world, they essentially take people out of the world. They're taking you to deeper and deeper states of meditation, to transcendence. What's your opinion? Like, how do you feel about how having a child is actually an experience that draws you back into the world? Like, how can having a child help someone live a more spiritual life? Like, how do we reframe that conversation so it becomes part of that process instead of like, oh, now all of a sudden I'm having children and it is somehow a distraction from my yoga practice and I have to get back to my yoga practice or something like that. Like, how do you feel it can actually enhance our experience as spiritual beings?
It's a really great question, and it's probably the question I'm most interested in my life. And for me, I think it's really different for every person, and there's a lot of cliche available there too, but instead of, it's two-sided. One of the sides is that as women, we need support to have discrete practice. Maybe not right away, but 6 months or a year, we need to build families and mothers into spiritual community, because most women have the experience that, the teachers don't really know what to do with you. It's considered disruptive to have noise in most yoga classes or meditation rooms. And so all of a sudden you're kind of spiritually disenfranchised once you become a mother, because there's not like the meaning of Sangha really changes. And for me, it was very distinct because I moved back to my spiritual home, so to speak, with my daughter, and I'm a single mom. And when I moved back, I really thought, oh, we're going to parent together and we're going to help each other because we're a Sangha, and I'll watch all the kids at some point so other people can practice, and then they can watch and I can practice. And really what happened was everyone was clamoring for their own practice, almost as like a lifeline. Like, people were struggling so hard because they were so used to having their spiritual practice almost as medicine that they couldn't really ground themselves and feel balance without that. And then I moved back to my hometown and reconnected with some of my friends, like not even great friends, just acquaintances from high school. And they became my Sangha because they were totally supportive. Like, oh, I can see you never have any time alone. Go for a walk and just leave your daughter here and take your time. It's okay. And so there's that element that we need to really look at. What are we using our spiritual practice for? And if I'm practicing 7 days a week and I can't give up one day of my practice so that another mother in the community can have 1 day out of 7 days to practice, whatever that practice looks like, because for me, that rally would have looked like a walk around the block or sitting on my cushion for 10 minutes or just having time to have my discrete physical and emotional experience without a being attached to me. On the other hand, of course, like we all know, the idea of practice is that it extends into every part of our lives, and that we don't have to sit on our cushion. We don't have to get on the mat. And what becoming a mother showed me was that all of the little ways that we're attempting to create experience where we lose control in practice, like what Shavasana is designed so that we have a feeling that we're not just our body, birth does that, 100-fold. So it's like birth and mothering are the experience that practice is only trying to emulate. And so to me, practice is what brought me into motherhood rather, is what brought me into the material world and really made me believe in it, because I'd spend a lot of time really in in practices that I didn't realize were doing it, but were really kind of taking me into the transcendent space. And that space really wasn't an effective place to mother from. And it was a bit of an identity crisis for me, because it's, and also physically, I could do my physical practice. Like, I remember doing yogi dandasana when I was about a year postpartum, and I was the deepest in it in the class that I was in. And then the next day I was like, my ligaments were still so soft. That's why I was getting so deep into the pose. And then I like suffered for the next week. And I remember thinking, like, my physical body can do all of this, but my energetic body is not connected right now to my physical body. And that's why it's hurting me more than helping me. And I really had to let go of the practice, the form of the practice. And I had a pretty big toolkit. I mean, I'd studied personally with Deskachar and Iyengar and Patabi Joy. So it's not like, oh, I just was an Ashtangi and I had to do second series or anything. I had a pretty big toolkit, but even the toolkit I had wasn't extending into what I needed in that phase of recovery. And I haven't really gone back to practice as I knew it before. And it's, for me, it's been very important to see how motherhood has polished me in a way that my practice couldn't. And I feel like for the better.
And I'd say the similar experience happens with fatherhood as well. I know for me, just having a lifelong relationship to spiritual practice, which most of which was taking me further away from the world than becoming a father, very much similar to your experience. It's like, well, there's a part of it that doesn't actually translate well to that fully embodied living experience that having a child and being a parent really demands out of you. And so there was a big struggle there, and still becomes a constant process of integration for me. But one of the things as a father, I feel sometimes a little left out or discouraged by things as silly as like a mommy and me yoga class. It's like, well, what about daddy and me yoga? Like there can sometimes be this other emphasis too that I'm curious to get your opinion on what role do you feel the masculine plays in all of this, in the process of motherhood, whether it's a woman's own inner masculine or an actual person in their life taking on the role of the masculine. Where does that fit in this process of both initiation, of parenthood being part of the spiritual process? Where does it all fit?
I think that's an evolving question that I am not sure that I have the best insight on, especially as a woman who's parented alone. I think that we are moving into a time where it's shifting. But what I really think is that, birth is a feminine space, and certainly whoever is in the birth space is going to be highly impacted. And from couple to couple, it's going to be different, the kind of support that a woman wants, and how there are men that their level of participation is really almost 50-50, and that they want to have that amount of engagement and interaction. And from what I've read statistically, it's really high in terms of, like, it's something like 75% of all men wish that they could have more time with their children, and fathers are really wanting to get more involved. And I see that on the playground at my daughter's school. I'd say it's half, if not more, fathers dropping their kids off at school and going on the playground and talking to each other. So that was really a revelation for me when I moved back to the US, of just how participatory men have become. In the postpartum time. I mean, one of the reasons that I think it's so important that men are creating the space, investing the time, even if it's not them that's serving the woman, which actually I think it's better to have other women serving the woman at that time, because that means the man is getting served too. I mean, if there's someone coming over and making food, they're making food for both people. And I think that it's such an important time, but the feminine really is at the forefront. So we could take sex as an example. Female pleasure has to come to the forefront postpartum, and it's often very jarring in terms of what we've conceived sex to be. And as a culture, both men and women are so acculturated to sex is penis and vagina friction, adrenalized sex, that it's very strange when after birth women don't want what they wanted before, and it's often confusing for both people, because what they had before they were most of the time both satisfied with. And so, but women start to realize that maybe they were tolerating in a way that they didn't even realize that they were tolerating beforehand. And so when female pleasure and experience becomes the center of the sexual interaction, it requires a whole nother level of attention and listening. And it can be a really deepening and a rich process. And again, one it's not forever. Of course, it will change the flavor and the tone in the future. It doesn't mean that there won't be other things that arrive, but we're so indoctrinated to, women, it's like we are so conditioned to think that we have to please our partner. Every woman who comes into my office who's having a question about her sex drive postpartum or how she's feeling about her sexuality, they're all feeling terribly guilty. They all say their husbands are great and they're married to the greatest guy, and they don't know how long he's going to be patient, and they're worried about him losing his patience, and they're doing things just to satisfy and not really having conversations. And so I really do think at this, especially because we're talking about birth and postpartum, it's really a time to serve the feminine, and for men to find a way that's just as deeply satisfying in the learning that comes from that and the deepening of relationship through that. So like I said, since I haven't really, I've been very activated in my own masculine in this process. I'm just coming out of that because I'm just moved back to a place where I live close to my parents and I have more support than I've ever had parenting. So I'm able to relax that a little bit, but I'm the breadwinner and the nurturer and the homemaker and everything. And so that's my own circumstance.
And how do you feel that we change this paradigm? Like, how do we, in the whole context of our conversation so far, like, how do we help to, on a community and personal level, how do we bring initiation more into this experience? How do the masculine and feminine come together, both man and woman and our combinations of the masculine and feminine? How do we all come together to shift this paradigm so that women are getting more support, so that families are getting more support, and we're really utilizing this really powerful time of transition for everyone involved to really help on the spiritual side of our lives, where it's really evolving us instead of just something that's happening to us. It becomes a vehicle of transformation instead of an impediment too. How do we change that? How do we shift that?
I'm a huge fan of circle practice. I think that we need single gender circle practice. I think women need to sit with other women, and I think men need to sit with other men. And then I think we need circle practice that's with all genders and time to share there. And that requires a real slowing down, and it requires a shift in priority. But I think that it's what most people are starving for. And I do see that starting to happen. But, men need to talk to other men about the transition to fatherhood and what they're feeling and how and the support that they need. And we also need to ask for help, and we need to offer our help. So, when we know somebody is a new mom or a new dad, we need to go and sit with them and be with them and allow there to be space for someone to open up to us about what they're experiencing, and create those spaces. If you're missing a dad and me kind of experience, create that. And we have to be proactive, because those spaces they don't organize themselves. And so I've noticed the things that I'm missing, it just kind of like, okay, it does seem like one more thing to do, but it's so important to offer that support. And I mean, I'm sure that you're a parent yourself, it's like the needs change, that they're so concrete. The kind of friendship we need somebody who, like, when we pulled an all-nighter because our kid's up all night throwing up, that actually just shows up in the morning and takes our kid to the park so that we can sleep for 2 hours. You need really tangible, concrete support. So I think it starts on the broad level is like circle practice. I mean, how often does somebody who has just gotten their period sit with somebody in their 20s, sit with a new mom, sit with someone in menopause and just talk about meaningful things? Or for men, just provide, most of the men that I work with in my office just say, I don't have these conversations with anyone. So it's just having the conversations. And, I'm working on a lot of levels. I'm working at a policy level with organizations like Center for the Parental Leave Leadership Change, so that people who work in traditional jobs have an adequate amount of maternal and paternity leave. And then, at the local level is participating in the circles, and then also finding out when people need help and what period of life that they're in, and trying to provide some of that support.
And how would you feel people, for our listeners in particular, can get started on something like that? Is it simple? Is it as simple as calling up their friends and saying like, hey, come over, let's sit down and share a circle together, share our stories together? Are there tools or tips that you would suggest to people to help really actualize that?
There's a couple great organizations like the Awakening Women's Institute. They have a downloadable guide. I think it's called like the Women's Temple Guide. So if someone didn't know how to lead a circle, because to have an effective circle, it is a bit more than just gathering your friends, unless the friends that you hang out with have that practice, because you need to set the container and have a few guidelines about how to share and how to hold space for other people. Um, Sometimes you might find somebody in your community who already is holding circle practice and see. I know here in Southern California, there's circles that are called sistership circles, and pretty much if you want to know about the feminine arts too, you can contact your local midwives and local doulas. They are almost always tapped into the sacred feminine arts and things that are going on with that. But it can be as simple as your next door neighbor who just had a baby going over there and washing their dishes for them, or asking them what they most need, and shifting the perspective, even in just like gift giving. If you go to a baby shower, and instead of getting the baby a present, getting the mom something that, a mom that's for herself, that's not for the baby or for the dad.
So I like to switch gears just a little bit here and get into some practical tips, because I mean you have such a wealth of knowledge, and something that I've encountered a lot, both with students, even in the experience with my own wife. For women that have had a cesarean section for whatever reason during their first birth, and they want to have a natural birth their second time around if they're having children again, what are some tools that you'd recommend that women can actually utilize? Because I do hear often from them, they get plenty of advice that, okay, well, every birth is unique and you just have to let the process happen. But what are some things they can actually do to prepare for their next birth if they're wanting to have a natural birth?
Great question. So there's a lot that goes into any single birth scenario. And when people are preparing for a VBAC, vaginal birth after cesarean, there's several things I think are really helpful. One of them is called birth story medicine. It's that term itself is from Pam England, who wrote the book Birthing from Within, and she's a midwife and she's a shaman, and she's been working with birth stories for over 35 or 40 years. And there's lots of birth story medicine practitioners around the country, and you can find them on Birthing from Within website. I'm also a birth story medicine practitioner. And really, there's usually some cleanup that needs to be done from the first birth. So I've seen people who've had cesareans for their first birth and did not, which they consider to be unnecessary. So there's all different kinds of cesareans. Some are scheduled, some are considered necessary, some later people feel are unnecessary. So somebody had an unnecessary cesarean, and then went back and chose the same hospital, same doctor, and basically had the same birth all over again. And that is really a sign of trauma, because when we're traumatized, our nervous system tends to lead us into situations that are familiar and repetitive. And so we really need to interrupt and heal the trauma from the first birth in order to be able to have a different outcome the second time. So birth story medicine is really effective with that. Somatic experiencing trauma resolution therapy is another really effective way of processing that trauma. Oftentimes, just talking isn't enough. So, on the physical side, which nothing is just physical, but the scar tissue needs to be really pliable and malleable from the first birth. I do something called a birth rehearsal, which is internal pelvic floor work. So I actually work vaginally, put my fingers in the vagina. I stretch the perineal muscles. I help a woman find the pushing muscles she might never have pushed the first time. And in our culture, we're really into squeezing and tightening the vagina, like Kegels, 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 but we don't really have the education about releasing and letting go. So I don't think that like the midst of birth is a good time to be trying to find those muscles for the first time. So you could get that work from a pelvic floor physical therapist. You could get that work from a sexological body worker, which is what I am. Tammy Lynn Kent, who wrote The Wild Feminine, she's a pelvic floor PT in Portland. She's trained a lot of practitioners. You can find those practitioners on her website. So you need to work on the emotional and nervous system side of things. You need to work on the physical side of things. And then you need to do the things externally, which are to set yourself up for that. So you need to choose a practitioner that you know is actually an advocate for it. So just tolerating it isn't good enough. Tolerating natural birth or tolerating VBACs, that's not going to help you. You need someone who actually actively works for that. And you need, so either your midwife or your doctor who's done a lot of VBACs before and feels like that's something that's viable and probable. And then also hospital or birth center or wherever you're birthing is also supportive of VBACs.
Awesome. So, I mean, it's obvious that you have such a wealth of knowledge, and I kind of just want to keep on keep on talking and hearing everything that you have to say. But for the sake of time and our show and everything, I got kind of one final question for you. Let's say you're walking down the street and you meet a woman who's, let's just say, a few months pregnant. Maybe she's in her second trimester. What advice do you give this woman? I mean, you've got just a short walk alongside of them. And to really sum up the work that you do and get clear with everything, like what advice could you give this woman on the birthing experience and her whole upcoming journey?
Which you said she's in her first trimester?
I mean, any trimester really. I mean, we're just assuming that there's a pregnant woman walking down the street, and since our culture doesn't offer a whole ton of support, and just talking about the birthing experience in general, how can you distill so much of your wisdom in a way that could offer some support to this woman?
It's a hard question because so many pregnant women are just inundated by unwelcome advice, like people are just throwing their own birth experiences at the women. And usually I would just try to really look into their eyes and make contact with them and ask them how they're really doing with the whole experience. And when women come to me in their third trimester and they come to me for a birth rehearsal, mostly what I talk to them about is the postpartum period, because that's usually what no one's talked to them about before. So, most women have taken childbirth education classes, have given a good amount of thought to the kind of birth that they want to have, maybe even written a birth plan. And so my contribution would just be, have you thought about writing a postpartum plan? Have you talked with your partner about how your relationship's going to change after you have a baby? What do you have in place for care for you? I mean, pretty much across the board, when I ask women, okay, so after the baby, who's going to take care of you? They just look at me with a blank stare, like, what do you mean, who's going to take care of me? And I'm like, well, are you going to have anybody with you? And they're like, oh, my husband's got a week off work. And I'm like, and like, who do you think might cook for you? Or, and it's just so off the radar. It just really, I mean, it's crazy because anyone who's had a baby knows, it's hard to walk around for a few days. And the midwives say 5 days in the bed, 5 days on the bed, 5 days around the bed. So that's 15 days not even leaving your room. And, okay, so your partner is going to be home for 5 or 7 of those days. What are you going to do for the rest of the 10? Who's going to cook your meals? Who's going to get you a glass of water when you can't move because you're breastfeeding? Who's going to talk to you when it's difficult? So because I'm such a strong advocate and for that time, and because I've lived it myself, and then I see women go through it, I'm really wanting women to set themselves up for success at that time, because unfortunately normally the culture would set you up for success, but that's not the reality that we're living in right now. So women really have to advocate for themselves, and that's a lot, because in our culture we're not taught to love ourselves, and we're taught that it's selfish to put our needs first. And people will pay all kinds of money to get married, and they'll pay all kinds of money for honeymoons, and they'll even, pay a lot of money for the birth they want. But like investing money in care for a woman postpartum, that's a lot of women won't do that. I mean, I have women who call me and I don't take insurance, and they're several months out of the birth. Let's say they're 6 months postpartum, and they're having some pretty severe problem, like they're having incontinence, or they're having, they feel like they're prolapsed, and they won't spend $150 to come and resolve it. And it's like, if their baby needed something, you better believe they're going to spend 150. They're going to spend, $15,000 if their baby needs something. But for women to put their own health at the center of the equation is really pretty radical.
I think the work that you're doing is so profound and important, in particular in our culture, just because as we've discussed, like it seems like we've sort of disenfranchised this whole experience of birthing and women and supporting them through that. And what I keep hearing from you again and again is this really important need to support women through the process, for women to support women, for men to support women, for men to support men through the process, so we can be better supports for the women through the process, the whole thing. And I think that I get so encouraged when I hear people like you doing the work that you're doing, supporting women in our society and our culture, because I think we do need a paradigm shift. We need a shift and change so that this process can really be the process that it's meant to be, instead of this weird, we go to hospitals when people are sick, and we treat pregnancy like a sickness in our culture in many ways. It's like, only the doctor can treat this. And like I said, I just get so encouraged that there are people like you out there helping to shift and change this paradigm. So as a personal side note, just thank you so much for the work that you're doing. How do people find out more about you, about the work that you're doing? Magamama.com, I know, is your website. Is that the best place for people to go? Do you have anything coming up that you want to share to our listeners?
Yeah, that's the best place to go. And if you go there, there's also a 20-minute audio visualization on the pelvic floor, and on how to access the different sphincters in the pelvic floor, and sort of how to learn a Kegel, because a lot of times people think they're doing them, but they're actually not doing them. So that's kind of useful. There's an upcoming conference I'm really excited about. It's an online conference called Sex, God, and Yoga. And it's happening at the end. It's the July 18th through 22nd. And I'm really honored to be a part of it, because there's some real amazing visionaries like Angela Farmer and Uma Dinsmore Tully, and a lot of amazing yoginis. And I'll be talking specifically about motherhood and sexuality, and the integration of what our Western culture offers us, which is sort of Mother Mary, Virgin Mother, and then Mary Magdalene, prostitute, and how to integrate sort of the mother prostitute archetypes within ourselves. And twice a year, I teach a course called Forging a Feminine Path, Women's Sexuality and Spirituality, through Viva Institute, which is a really great 4-week course that has some daily reflections on how we view our spirituality and sexuality, and sort of the intersection of both of those. And in a way, it's sort of like our spirituality gets grouped with Mother Mary, and our sexuality gets grouped with Mary Magdalene, and just how we can begin to see ourselves beyond those categories. And when, as women, we see ourselves and define ourselves outside of those categories, then men will also start to see us outside of those primary archetypes.
And is that an online course or is that an in-person course?
That's an online course.
Awesome. And people can find out both. I know on your Facebook page you have, I've seen the image for the conference in July. Is all that stuff on your website, the conference, and as well as that the training that you're a part of or that you do?
That's right, yeah.
Awesome. Well, Kimberly, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really, really appreciate your wisdom. I appreciate all the work that you're doing in the world. I'm sure that our listeners have learned a lot. So again, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you all to the listeners who tuned in for today. I hope you all have a wonderful and very present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the show today. Please go over to iTunes, write a review, let us know what you think. It helps us in creating new content for all of you. It also helps new listeners get a sense of what to expect from the show. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks again for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.